we want to focus on the institution of the U.S. empire. We now know who won the 2024 elections here in the U.S., but I think one question on many minds since Trump's victory last week is how much Gaza played a role in the Democratic Party's defeat. A lot of attention has been put on Arab American or Muslim American voters, many of whom are particularly concerned about family and friends in Palestine and Lebanon, of course. One place where it appears clear that they made a decisive difference is the battleground state of Michigan, where Trump won by 80,000 votes. We'll also talk about how the incoming Trump administration is starting to shape up. Ali, let's start off with what we know about the impact of the Arab American vote in Michigan.
Yeah, there was a lot of attention on Michigan. It was one of the 7 swing states, and as is well known, it's home to a large Arab American community. One state estimate from 2013 put the Arab American population of Michigan at about 500,000 people, or about 5% of the total population. And 80% live in southeast Michigan in Wayne County, which includes the cities of Detroit, Dearborn Heights, and Hamtramck. According to University of Michigan political studies professor Michael Traugott, he points out that Biden made no public effort to engage with Arab American leaders in Wayne County before he withdrew from the election campaign or afterwards. The Kamala Harris campaign did do some outreach, but mostly in private. At the same time, Traugott notes, Donald Trump made multiple visits to Arab American groups during the general election campaign. He used his daughter Tiffany's father-in-law, Mes'ad Boulos, a Lebanese American, as a surrogate. And the mayors of Hamtramck and Dearborn Heights actually endorsed Trump. Now, did all this make a difference? According to Traugott's analysis, it did. He says that in 2020, the Biden-Harris team won almost 69% of the vote in Dearborn. By contrast, in 2024, Harris got just 36% of the vote. That's half the vote share Biden got 4 years ago. And Jill Stein and the Green Party ended up getting 18%, which is extraordinarily high for a third party historically in the United States. In Dearborn Heights, Trump defeated Harris by 44 to 13%, by 44 to 38%. And again, Jill Stein of the Green Party took 15% of the vote. So that's another huge reversal for the Democrats. Traugott concludes that in the swing state of Michigan, Harris's inability to win over Arab Americans played a small but significant role in allowing Trump to win by 80,618 votes. And here's another fact. According to the exit polls, 4% of Michigan voters said foreign policy was their top issue in deciding how to vote. And that might not sound like much, but remember that Trump's margin of victory was just over 1% in Michigan. So Gaza and Lebanon could have been the decisive difference in that state, if not in others.
Yeah. Well, that's Michigan. What about the rest of the country?
Yeah, it's difficult to know exactly how much Gaza played a role. There's probably a lot of people who stayed home or voted third party in states where the vote between Harris and Trump was not as close as in those swing states or battleground states. But we can take note of the following. Just like in Michigan, 4% of voters nationwide told exit pollsters that foreign policy was their most important issue. That compares with 11% who said their most important concern was immigration and 32% who said it was the economy. Now, Trump talks about immigration more than anything else, even though just 11% of Americans say that that's their top issue. So again, in an election this close, that 4% who put foreign policy first matters. Overall, nationwide, there was a 3% swing from Democrats to Republicans compared with 2020. But it's important to note this was not due to any huge surge in votes for Donald Trump. In 2020, 4 years ago, President Biden won just over 81 million votes, or 51.3% of the total, while Donald Trump won just over 74 million votes. In 2024, Trump did improve his performance somewhat, receiving 75.5 million votes. So he gained over a million votes. But the big story is that Kamala Harris received less than 72 million votes. That is almost 10 million fewer votes than Joe Biden received 4 years ago. That was enough to give Trump 50.5% of the total and send him back to the White House. But if Kamala Harris had just matched Biden's performance in 2020, she would be president. Instead, 10 million people who voted for Biden in 2020 just stayed home. We don't know all the reasons why they refused to vote, but a YouGov poll for CBS News in June found that 36% of voters said that the war between Israel and Hamas would be a major factor in how they decided to vote. Not necessarily the only factor, but a major factor. So it's reasonable to think that the Democratic Party backed genocide was a factor that led many people to stay home and refuse to vote for Kamala Harris or come out and vote third party.
Yeah, 36% is actually quite a big percentage. Um, and it's clear that the Biden-Harris administration didn't think it was important. Um, Ali, what do the exit polls tell us, if anything, about what role U.S. support for Israel specifically played in this year's election?
Yeah, I think uh, this exit poll compared with 4 years ago had specific questions because of the current context that you didn't see 4 years ago. And so the exit polls do tell us that among voters who think the US gives too much support for Israel, 67% voted for Harris, while 30% voted for Trump. You can see that here from CNN. Among those who think the US should support Israel even more than it does, 82% voted for Trump. So, in summary, it's clear that voters who are more sympathetic to Palestinians still overwhelmingly voted for the Democrats. And that's in line with what polls have shown consistently for years, that the Democratic Party base is far more supportive of Palestine than the party's leaders and big donors. Recall that 59% of Americans want Joe Biden to encourage Israel to decrease or end its military actions in Gaza, according to that same YouGov CBS poll from June. And 61% said the US should stop sending weapons to Israel. That includes 77% of Democrats and nearly 40% of Republicans. But neither party reflects that clear American majority in favor of ending arms transfers to Israel. But you can say that the Republicans are the more democratic party in the sense that they're more in line with their supporters, whereas the Democratic Party leadership goes completely against the
Yeah,
wishes and views of its supporters.
yeah. What can we conclude about the role that Arab American and or Muslim voters played in the election then?
Well, as I just said, this underlines just how undemocratic the Democratic Party is because they simply refuse to reflect the views on the question of the party, the views of their supporters. Um, and it's also important to remember that it is not just Arab Americans or Muslims who consider genocide to be a red line. However, I think it does show that Arab Americans and Muslims can play a potentially decisive role in national politics in the United States, but it is not by unconditionally tying themselves to a Democratic Party whose leaders and donor class despise them and are willing to commit genocide against their families. Remember that the Democratic Party refused even to put a token Palestinian on stage at the Democratic National Convention last summer. You'll remember, Nora, that we spoke to Hatem Aboudiah about that
Oh,
back
yeah.
in August. Um, even if, and they refused even when the uncommitted movement made clear that that Palestinian was going to make no specific demands and just sing Kamala Harris's praises and endorse her. So what we've learned is that Arab American and Muslim communities can be influential by standing up and saying, do not take us for granted. We're willing to make you lose when you attack our fundamental rights and interests. Of course, we're now going to have Donald Trump as president, and that does not necessarily mean any immediate improvement. But at least some former Democratic voters have shown they're willing to make the party pay a price for its crimes. Many will hope that this will cause some reflection that the Democratic Party cannot continue to treat its own supporters with such utter contempt and continue to be reelected. I'm
Yeah.
sure that many others will think that the Democrats are simply hopeless and unreformable, but we will
Yeah.
see.
We'll see. Well, can we expect them to do anything different in their last 2 months before handing over the White House to Donald Trump on January 20th? I mean, they just proved that this, arbitrary 30-day, so-called deadline to, get Israel to shape up its humanitarian aid response in Gaza, that passed, and Blinken and the entire State Department spokesperson
Yeah,
department
I actually have
were
a
like,
clip. I
"Oh,
actually
you
have a
do?
clip of that I'm going to show you. Yeah. So
Good."
of course, yeah. Before we even talk about Trump, what Trump might do, let's remember that for the next 2 months and a bit, Joe Biden is still the president and Kamala Harris is still the vice president. So even though they are lame ducks, they still have enormous power that they could use to stop this genocide if they wanted to do that. And
I mean,
so
she
far,
keeps saying that she's, what happens to working tirelessly around the clock for a ceasefire? I mean, is she still going to do that? It's
well,
2 months.
let's find out. But so far, they've shown no sign that they're going to do that. I mean, they have said the war in Gaza should end, but you know, as you
But to them,
say,
yeah, and means surrender and a quiet death. That's it.
right. So, but as you pointed out, Nora, on October 13th, so exactly a month ago, Secretary of State Antony Blinken and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin issued that joint letter demanding that Israel make concrete progress within 30 days to reverse the catastrophic humanitarian situation caused by Israel's deliberate policy of starving the population in Gaza. You'll also recall that a few weeks ago on this live stream, we talked with Layla Al-Arian about how the US government knowingly covered up how Israel is blocking humanitarian aid to people in Gaza, because admitting this fact would trigger that provision in US law that prohibits military assistance to any foreign government that obstructs US humanitarian aid. And as we heard in your news brief, 8 international humanitarian organizations, including Oxfam, Save the Children, and Refugees International, issued that report just a couple of days ago, finding that during this 30-day period, Israel's actions failed to meet any of the specific criteria set out in the US letter. So, and in fact, they find that over the last 30 days, Israel took actions that dramatically worsened the situation on the ground, particularly in northern Gaza. So, by law, under Section 620I of the US Foreign Assistance Act, the US is required to halt all arms transfers to Israel. That's a legal requirement. But the Joe Biden Kamala Harris administration has decided to ignore its own 30-day deadline. The State Department confirmed that there will be no consequences for Israel failing to meet the conditions set out in US law and in that October 30th letter. Let's look at this brief clip of Associated Press correspondent Matt Lee sparring with State Department spokesperson Vedant Patel at the press briefing on Tuesday, November 12th, the day the 30-day deadline set by the United States expired.
All right, so essentially, there isn't going to be any consequence for Israel not meeting the.
I certainly don't have a change in U.S. policy to announce today, Matt, but as you just heard me say, we are constantly going to assess the circumstances on the ground. We are looking for some of these steps that we've made. We want to make sure that they are sustained and expanded upon, and certainly if we don't see that, if we don't continue to see steps in the appropriate direction, we certainly will enforce U.S. law.
Yeah, yeah.
There's no doubt about it.
But you guys were the ones that gave them the 30-day deadline. It's hard to see your answers today, such as they are, as anything other than kind of giving them a pass for not meeting the
Certainly,
criteria that were
Matt,
laid out in the letter.
Yeah, and that actually is a much longer exchange, but I just wanted to show that short clip. And you know how bad things are when even the CNN correspondent is challenging the State Department over this. And if you watch the whole briefing, you'll see even CNN standing up to the government on this. But even with the election behind them, the Democrats are doubling down on their commitment to seeing this genocide through until the very end. And I just have to wonder how anyone could believe that if Kamala Harris had been elected, that she would do anything different. There is nothing at stake for them now. They lost the election. They could do the right thing if they wanted to, but they don't want to. Starving and killing Palestinians is not just political expediency for the Democrats. It's a labor of love. They're doing it because they're deeply committed to genocide.
Yeah. I mean, obviously it's hard to, we don't want to speculate, and it's hard to predict anything, especially when it comes to Trump and the people that he's picking for his administration. But given the trajectory of this genocide authored by the Democratic Party, are things likely to be any different under Trump that you can see?
Well, Trump is an opportunist with no fixed principles, and that makes him unpredictable. You could paint scenarios that are hopeful, like maybe Trump will want this all wrapped up before he takes office. Maybe he'll get on the phone with Netanyahu and say, "Look, if you want our support, end this before I take over." But I don't have any basis to believe that. It's just, wouldn't it be wonderful if that happened? During the campaign, he sent mixed signals, both of very strong support to Israel and its lobby, and also telling Arab Americans that he was the one that was going to bring peace. Maybe he means both of them and he thinks both are possible, but there are some hard facts we can't ignore. Trump's campaign, and Craig Mukhaiber just made reference to this, received $100 million from Miriam Adelson, the pro-Israel, pro-genocide extremist who inherited the casino fortune of her late husband, Sheldon Adelson. But this is really canceled out. I mean, a lot of people focus on this, but to me, it's canceled out by the fact that the Biden and Harris administration are also very reliant on pro-Israel mega donors. Here, for example, there's an article from Israel's Haaretz newspaper from May highlighting the many so-called Jewish mega donors bankrolling the Democrats. They are overwhelmingly strongly pro-Israel, and the most generous of them, Hollywood billionaire Haim Saban, notoriously said a few years ago, and I quote, "I'm a one-issue guy, and my issue is Israel."
I remember that. What about Trump's early appointments? What does this signal? What does this tell us about the nature of this administration that's coming back to the White House?
They don't show that there's going to be any difference from Biden in terms of substance, but we're likely to see a more direct style. Whereas the Democrats try to play down their anti-Palestinian extremism, Republicans play it up. On the one hand, Trump ruled out inviting Mike Pompeo, who was Secretary of State in the first Trump administration, and Nikki Haley, who was his UN ambassador, into his next administration. Both are, of course, extremely anti-Palestinian, hawkish, neoconservative warmongers. This tweet from Donald Trump Jr., the president-elect's son, has attracted a lot of attention. Don Jr. is responding to a podcaster called Dave Smith, who writes, quote, The Stop Pompeo movement is great, but it's not enough. Right now, we need maximum pressure to keep all neocons and war hawks out of the Trump administration. They've had their time at the table and brought nothing but disaster to the world and this country. That's a sentiment I certainly agree with. And so does Don Jr., who responded, agreed 100%, I'm on it. So the implication is that Donald Trump Jr. is exerting a lot of influence to try to keep war hawks out of his father's administration. However, the reality is that neocon war hawks and Israel lobbyists are largely the same group of people. So it would be impossible to keep neocon war hawks out of the administration while letting Israel lobbyists in. And the appointments announced by Trump so far show absolutely no effort to keep either out. Trump has announced Elise Stefanik, an ultra anti-Palestinian congresswoman from New York, as his next UN ambassador. As a member of Congress, you'll remember that she led the attacks against American universities for not doing enough to suppress speech in support of Palestinian rights. He also named or nominated former Arkansas Governor Mike Huckabee, a fanatical Christian Zionist and Israel lobbyist, as the next U.S. ambassador to Israel. Let's take a look at Mike Huckabee speaking in favor of Israel annexing the occupied West Bank. And I believe this clip is labeled as being from 2017, so just a few years ago.
My feeling personally, and I'm speaking only as a person, I think Israel would only be acting on the property it already owns. I think Israel has title deed to Judea and Samaria. There are certain words I refuse to use. There is no such thing as a West Bank. It's Judea and Samaria. There's no such thing as a settlement. They're communities, they're neighborhoods, they're cities. There's no such thing as an occupation.
A sentient meatball.
Right. So not only does Huckabee not believe in the occupation or the West Bank, but he also said in 2008, and I'm quoting here, he said, there's really no such thing as a Palestinian. So he doesn't believe in the existence of Palestinians either. And in that same speech, he said that if there was going to be a Palestinian state, it should be in Syria, Jordan, or Egypt. And those are views that he's repeated since then. And in a new interview that I just saw news of circulating this morning, Huckabee told Israeli Army radio that there is a chance Israel might be able to annex the West Bank during Trump's second term. So that's that so far. But the more senior appointments, remember, these ambassadors, they're not policymakers. They may have some influence, but they're not the policymakers. The policymaking positions so far are no better. Trump has already named Republican Congressman Mike Waltz from Florida as his national security advisor. Waltz is extremely hostile towards China and fanatically pro-Israel and pro-war. Trump has also nominated Fox News host Pete Hegseth as defense secretary, which is extraordinary. This is a TV host who he's going to put in charge of the $1 trillion US military. Hegseth is another anti-Iran hawk and pro-Israel fanatic. And here's a clip of him interviewing Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in March. Hegseth actually tweeted this clip out along with the words, Israel needs our support. Let's take a look.
As Israel still fights to defend itself from the brutal military attack on their country, when more than 1,200 Israelis were murdered, and still Hamas holds more than 100 hostage. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu joins us live from Jerusalem with an update. Mr. Prime Minister, thank you very much for being with us. The calls for a ceasefire at this point are extortion. The other, on behalf of Hamas.
Yeah, I'm not going to subject you to Netanyahu, but I just wanted you to hear how Hegseth framed calls for a ceasefire as extortion of Israel. And in other Fox News commentaries, he explicitly refers to both Gaza and the West Bank as part of the, quote, state of Israel. And here's another really extraordinary clip of Pete Hegseth speaking to a group called Young Israel a few years ago. I couldn't figure out if this was in 2018 or 2019 because he's apparently spoken to this group more than once.
Anyone that wants to take the stage and talk about dual loyalty is dead wrong. What this organization represents, what Western civilization represents today, is an understanding that Zionism and Americanism are the front lines of Western civilization and freedom in our world today.
There you have it, Zionism and Americanism.
I mean, he's not wrong.
Well, they're the front lines of something, but
front
not,
lines of something. Zionism and
Americanism.
Americanism.
No,
no. They're on the front lines of what they decree is what he said, Western civilization.
Yeah. And then just the other big appointment is Trump has named his former director of national intelligence, John Ratcliffe, as head of the CIA. Ratcliffe has accused Iran of committing what he calls acts of war against the United States by allegedly hacking Trump campaign emails and supposedly plotting to assassinate Trump. I've seen nothing that suggests those things are true. But here's a clip of him on Fox News accusing the Democrats of being too soft towards Tehran and calling for the United States and Israel to carry out joint military attacks on Iran. Again, this guy is going to be the head of the CIA.
Election, but that it really reveals the failed strategy of the Democrats over the last 10 years in dealing with Iran. You know, the famous Obama doctrine, which was that, look, we can deter Iran diplomatically and it won't come at the expense of Israel. Well, Barack Obama was wrong. He misunderstood the lethality and the evil nature of the Iranian regime. And what Israel has done is essentially employ the Trump doctrine, a maximum pressure campaign, understanding that the only way to deter terrorists like Iran and their proxies is to put your foot on their throat. And Israel has done that. We should be assisting Israel in doing so. But again, political expediency and the quest for power by Kamala Harris and the Democrats is resulting in American national security taking a backseat, unfortunately.
That's quite disturbing.
No comment.
Yeah, well, I'll make a comment.
Please.
I mean, first, I just want to say to acknowledge journalist Michael Tracy for highlighting that video on Twitter, which is where I found it. And of course, I mean, two things come to mind. Like, how can you pretend that keeping Mike Pompeo out of this administration is some kind of great move when you have someone who's essentially a carbon copy of Mike Pompeo taking the same job that Mike Pompeo had, head of the CIA, before he became Secretary of State? The other thing is, look at that false framing that, you know, the Democrats did nothing, as if the Biden administration has not been deploying massive US military forces to the region to help Israel in its war against the Palestinian people, in its war against Lebanon, and in its attacks on Iran. So Biden is doing literally the thing that he says the US should be doing, which is helping Israel to attack Iran.
What about Marco Rubio? Rumors that he's going to be Secretary of State. What do you make of that?
Yeah, it's a bit more than rumors. It's a lot of reporting in mainstream media that Trump is expected to name Marco Rubio as Secretary of State, but it is not yet confirmed as of right now. Of course, Rubio is a Republican senator from Florida, and he is another fanatical supporter of Israel and a neocon who supports aggressive confrontation with China, Iran, and Venezuela, among others. And campaign records show that Rubio's top donors include the Pro-Israel America Political Action Committee and the Israel lobby group AIPAC. So he is every bit as extreme and warmongering as Antony Blinken, Joe Biden's Secretary of State. And we just have to remember that Trump filled his last administration with exactly these type of people and largely continued their policies. He, of course, ordered the assassination of Iran's General Qasem Soleimani, ramped up sanctions and pressure on both Iran and Russia. He also started shipping weapons to Ukraine that even Barack Obama had refused to send. So Trump is, despite the rhetoric, as much a neocon president as his Democratic predecessors and successors.
Yeah. So how can we square this with that tweet from his son, Donald Trump Jr., claiming that he was going to be ensuring that there would be no neocons and war hawks in his dad's new administration?
Well, it's actually quite easy. And for once, we can actually find the answer in the New York Times. If you take a look at this headline from this morning, it says, once they were neocons, now Trump's foreign policy picks are all America first. And basically, the article explains that, quote, the Republican Party used to have a label for the kind of foreign policy hawk that President-elect Donald J. Trump named on Tuesday as his national security advisor and considering as his Secretary of State, neocons. And then it goes on to explain how all these characters have rebranded themselves and are now claiming, we're not neocons, we're America firsters. And so the New York Times concludes, the result is that Mr. Trump may end up with a foreign policy team composed of deep loyalists, but with roots in familiar Republican approaches. And of course, those are the same familiar Democratic approaches because this is the blob, the neocon imperial war machine spans both parties, and that's not going to change. So the bottom line is that these are exactly the same neocon warhawks who have consistently been expressing exactly the same extremist views right through the election campaign. Now they are simply being rebranded as anti-interventionist America firsters. Just as the genocidal Democrats market themselves as the party of empathy and inclusion, the genocidal Republicans are now marketing themselves as opponents of foreign wars. These two parties have the same policies, they just present them differently.
Yeah, indeed. Ali, do you see more continuity than change?
I think it's clear that in the grand scheme of things, the safe assumption is that the Trump administration will be absolute continuity, just as there was between the first Trump administration and Biden. As president, the first time around, Trump, of course, recognized Israeli sovereignty over occupied Jerusalem and the occupied Golan Heights, and Biden stuck to those policies. He never reversed them. Trump suspended funding for UNRWA, the UN Agency for Palestine Refugees. Biden came in and restored it, and then he suspended it again, and he still has not restored it. So I don't expect we'll see UNRWA funding coming back. Trump will not reverse Biden's decision to defund UNRWA. Every US administration is even more fanatically pro-Israel than the one before, and I don't think this will be an exception. I think if there will be any type of break from the foreign policy consensus, it would be around Ukraine. But given the number of anti-Russia fanatics that Trump is appointing, I doubt there will be much change there either. But Trump remains somewhat unpredictable and erratic, so you never know. Sometimes by accident, he does the right thing, and maybe we'll get lucky. But that's what it would have to be.
The broken clock theory.
Yeah.
What other factors might constrain him, finally?
Yeah, just very briefly, I think it's important to keep all this discussion in perspective. As Professor Mohammed Marandi has noted since the election, of course, we've had him on this live stream before, and hopefully we'll have him again. But in other interviews he's given on other programs, he's made the point, and I think this is a very important point, that the world of today is very different from the world of 2016 when Trump won election the first time. The US is still, of course, extremely powerful, but in relative terms, it is much weaker than it was 8 years ago. other countries, including Russia, China, Iran, and the axis of resistance are much stronger. As we discussed with 𝐄𝐥𝐿 𝐈𝐧𝐭𝐫𝐨𝐧𝐢𝐜 in the previous segment, the world, the global majority, is with Palestine and against what the United States is doing. And the US and Israel have not been able to defeat or control those they've decided are their enemies under Biden. And that, of course, includes the Palestinian and Lebanese resistance and Iran. And I think it's important that no matter how malevolent their intentions are, Trump and his his officials do not possess magic powers and magic military capabilities that Biden does not already have. So it may be that real change is not going to come from any internal political factors in the United States, but from regional resistance and global geopolitical power shifts that are going to continue to erode the influence, power, and freedom of action of the United States, regardless of who is in the White House.
Well, thanks for that, Ali.
And
yeah, go ahead.
go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say it's going to be an interesting 2 months. The last 2 months of the genocidal Biden-Harris administration, and then see how Trump takes the reins and manages this genocide. It's unspeakable. We're still here, 404 days.
And we will be following it. And I just also want to thank our Electronic Intifada colleague, Michael F. Brown, who helped with a lot of the research on some of these disgusting incoming administration officials.